Hi everyone, it's Shari here today, and I am going to be making this bright autumn card using one of my favorite sets, which is Happy Harvest. I just love that little scarecrow. Some other things I'm going to use is that Stitch woodgrain backdrop, the Stitch Hillsides landscape version, and the Leafy tree backdrop landscape version. I am going to be using the Distress watercolor cardstock to cut these out because I'm going to do some Distress ink blending. And you can see here I've already cut those pieces out of that Distress watercolor cardstock. So I'm going to do some Distress ink blending. You could also get a warm autumn look by using some pattern paper, but I just haven't played with my Distress inks lately and I really wanted to do that. There's going to be a lot of layers to this card. We're going to layer all these things on top of each other. So first I'm going to start with my tree, and I've got some vintage photo here. And I'm just going to color the tree because the border is going to get covered up by some other pieces, so there's no need for me to take the time to color the rest of the rectangle, just the tree part. So I'm just kind of going all over the tree with the vintage photo just to give it a layer of ink on all of the tree there. This is sort of the lightest brown I'm going to use, so I just want a base layer of ink. The next ink I went in with was Gathered Twigs, which is slightly darker but not too much of a contrast, and I just did it on some of the edges here and towards the top. And then finally I used some ground espresso, and it is a little darker, so I'm just doing it right along some edges of those branches and along one side of the trunk. And we're kind of going to be making like a sunset scene here, so lots of browns and oranges. So I'm going to set that aside and clean up my craft mat so I don't get any of that brown on the next layer I'm doing here. Now these are the hills, so I'm going to start with some scattered straw. And I'm just going to put a base layer of this ink down on the hills. Again, the frame part is going to get covered up. I'm going to cut a frame that covers up and frames everything. So I'm not going to concern myself with adding ink to the rectangular part of this die cut, just the hills. And once I've got a good layer of that scattered straw on there, I just want to darken up the edges of the hills. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a piece of scrap cardstock and just slip it inside that cut that was made by the die. And I'm going in with some fossilized amber and just putting that darker yellow more towards the top of that hillside. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other one. I don't really need the piece of paper. I only needed to mask it from the hill above. And I'm just going along the edge. So my hill in the front is a little darker just so it has a little more contrast. And then the hill in the back is a little lighter with the edge dark. Now the wood grain backdrop, stitch backdrop here that I cut is going to be the very back of my scene here. So this is going to be my sky. So I'm starting with Wild Honey, and this is going to be at the bottom closest to the hills. I'm not doing that side right there because that's going to be behind the hills, and so you're not going to see it. The next color I'm using here is Spice Marmalade, which is a nice orange color. And I'm just making my sort of sunset sky. And then finally, I'm going to use Abandoned Coral for the top. This is kind of a pinky red, but I think it blends with the orange really nicely. And you can see when you add the ink to that backdrop, the stitch lines really come out. Now to work on our Scarecrow here. So I am doing this in super speed because it is a lot of steps, but we're going to paper piece his clothes together using the Perfectly Plaid Chill collection that you see there. So I'm going to start by stamping him on some craft cardstock, and this way that's kind of the base for him, so that's going to be the color of his face, and then I can just paper piece everything on top of that. I'm going to use the die to cut him out, and it'll also give him a nice little craft outline because I'm cutting him out with the die. So now that I've got him there, I can work on the pieces of his clothing that I want to do with all these plaids. And of course I want his overalls to be this nice blue. And I'm stamping all these with the Soot ink because it's a nice dark ink. It's not the black, but it's still a really nice dark ink. I want his hat to be the yellow plaid here. He's got a little straw hat. I'm going to stamp his hat again on this aqua color because I want that to be the stripe in his hat. And then I'm also going to stamp part of his overalls because I want to cut his pocket out of this as well. And then finally for his shirt, I'm going to use one of the plaids with a couple colors in it. You know, I've kind of stuck with the more solid colored plaids for the other pieces, but I want his shirt to look like a plaid shirt. So I'm going to stamp his shirt on this piece with the yellow and the aqua on the white. So now you can fussy cut out these little pieces. Now these you have to cut out the actual piece and they're pretty small, but this is basically the top layer. The other pieces you can kind of cheat. So for with this hat, obviously I'm going to cut out the whole hat because that little stripe is going to go on top of this piece of paper. Now for his overalls, you do want to cut down between the little straps that hold them up so that the shirt's going to show through. But for the shirt, I kept part of the overalls there and I'll just overlap those two pieces. You could stamp the whole overalls, but I just did the very top. And now to kind of assemble my pieces here and get this little guy dressed. So you can see there's the little stripe on the hat and the pocket. I'm using my tweezers because these are pretty small pieces. And then I'm going to go ahead and put the shirt right on him. And then I will layer the overalls over top of that. And finally his straw hat. And this is actually really cute, just like this. But I'm going to go in with some colored pencils and just color in the straw that comes out from underneath his hat with a yellow and on his hands and the bottom of his overalls. And this is perfect for using on craft paper. Pencils really show up well on dark colored cardstock. And then I've got an orange here. I'm just going to color in his little nose. And I've got a pink. I'm just going to give him some little rosy cheeks. And then I'll go in with a dark brown and color the post that he's on. You could actually color this first if you wanted to, because sometimes it's hard to get up between the legs of the overalls. I've also cut the frame here. This is from Chili Pepper Cardstock, so this is just the largest stitch frame, and you can see it's going to cover up all those white pieces that I did not ink. And now it's time to assemble my card. So I've got a top folding card base here, and I'm going to start by putting the backdrop on, my sunset sky with the wood grain backdrop. And I actually didn't quite get it lined up perfectly. It's overhanging one side, so I've got some extra card sticking out. And since I used that extreme adhesive, there's really no pulling it off, but not a problem. It's easy to just trim that off. And now I don't have that excess hanging out. For the other pieces, you can see it's got that thin frame, so I'm using an adhesive that's a very fine line, and I'm adding some adhesive to the hills too, but just to the bottoms of the hills, because I'm going to be tucking some things behind the hills on the top. So I did not put adhesive on the top part of the hills, just the bottoms. Again, I'm using that really thin line adhesive for the frame of the tree. And also for the tree branches themselves, just because it's very thin and it's easy to use on these kind of shapes. So I'm going to layer that right on top of my hillsides. And then finally, I can layer the frame over all of it to finish it off. You could also use liquid glue as well. This is just a little faster to me. All right, now to assemble my little scene, I'm going to go ahead and put my Scarecrow on here. I didn't put too much adhesive on his arms and stuff because I'm going to be tucking some things sort of behind him a little bit. But this will hold him in place really nicely. And finally, I've stamped out some of the cornstalks using the sunflower ink as well as the dough ink just for a little variety in color. And I'm taking those and tucking them behind the hillside so they look like they're growing out of the hills. And I'm just varying where the colors go. I used two colors so they would kind of stand out from each other. I'm using my tweezers to help me tuck those behind the hillsides. And then for some shorter pieces, I'm just cutting off the bottom pieces of the corn stalks so I can get some shorter ones in there, have a little more variation in height. You're not going to see the bottoms of them if you tuck it behind the hills, so it really doesn't matter that you've trimmed it a little bit. I really like all these warm colors. I think the Scarecrow really stands out. And finally, to finish off, I'm going to stamp the sentiment on the inside because I don't want to mess up my scene that I've made with the sentiment. I really didn't leave a place for it because I knew it was going to be a very full framed scene here. So I'm using the sentiment that says many thanks, also from the Happy Harvest set. And I'm just using that Soot ink again. And I'm just going to line that up and stamp that right on the inside. And there is our beautiful autumn scene with our cute little Scarecrow and his plaid paper piecing. So here's another look. And then here is a close-up. Thanks for watching. Have an amazing day. Bye.